And I will turn it over to Rick.
Well, greetings, everyone. It's good to be here, and I appreciate all of you tuning in. I should probably start out by saying that I don't really consider myself to be a great authority on Marx and Engels. I have read some of their classic works, but for the most part, that was many years ago. And because I don't really claim to be a great authority, your interpretations have just as much weight, just as much importance as mine. And please don't feel hesitant about jumping in if there's something that I say that you disagree with, you have a different reading, a different interpretation. That is entirely fine. The essay, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, is one in which Friedrich Engels lays out the methodological approach that is associated with him and with his longtime collaborator, Karl Marx. The approach is commonly known as dialectical or historical materialism. Dialectical materialism is illustrated pretty much in all of Marx and Engels' works, but the basic premises are generally not laid out very systematically or explicitly. And this is one place, perhaps the only place, where the basic underlying assumptions of dialectical materialism are spelled out. Socialism, Utopian and Scientific consists of 3 parts, 3 chapters. These are actually an excerpt from a much longer book called Herr Dühring's Revolution in Science, or more commonly known as Anti-Dühring. Dühring was a prominent German social scientist in the mid to latter part of the 19th century. Engels and Marx disagreed rather vehemently with a number of the things that Dühring was saying, and Engels wrote the book as a refutation of Dühring's approach. Some collaborators of Engels felt that the sections that came to be known as Socialism, Utopian and Scientific were a good explication of the basic underlying assumptions behind dialectical materialism. They thought that it was worthwhile to lay that out in a way that was readily accessible. If you've done much reading of Marx and Engels, you know that much of what they wrote, especially Marx, but Engels as well, is pretty dense, and it takes a good deal of commitment to get through a lot of that material. So Engels and some of his supporters felt that it would be useful to have a pamphlet-length work that just laid out what they were trying to do, what they were all about. This is also a fairly late work for Marx and Engels. In fact, it was published just a few years before Marx's death. And that means that in Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels was able to take into account points made in many of their earlier works like the Communist Manifesto, the German Ideology, Marx's Capital, or the basic findings that Engels presented in The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, which was published around the same time as Socialism, Utopian and Scientific. I read this essay a long time ago, and I reread it for purposes of our discussion. And I was a little shocked to realize just how much I'd forgotten about what was in there, about how much territory the essay covers. Particularly, that's true of part 3, where Engels gets into the workings of capitalist economics in a fair amount of detail. Obviously, not the kind of detail that you find in Capital, but more than what I had recalled. Part 1 summarizes the history and perspectives of what Engels refers to as the Utopian Socialists. In part 2, Engels explains the idea of the dialectic, and in part 3, he focuses on material conditions that give rise to capitalism that he expected would lead to a socialist alternative. What I think I will do is try to lay out some of the basic points and the background of each of these in turn. Part 1 on utopian socialism describes and explains what utopian socialism is all about. He focuses on 3 main characters: Henri de Saint-Simon, Charles Fourier, and Robert Owen. These are probably the 3 most prominent so-called utopian socialists. It's probably worth noting that this is not what they called themselves or what they were doing, but it was Engels' description of what they were proposing and what they were trying to implement. And the expression really caught on, so that in this day and age, those 3 theorists and others who share many of their ideas are commonly referred to by many as utopian socialists. The first 2, Saint-Simon and Fourier, were French. Robert Owen was Welsh. They were early socialist theorists. Most of their work was in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. And the basic idea that motivated what they did was the notion that if people think the right things, if they have the right sympathies, if they can interact in a way that is mutually empathetic, working together, that we can do away with all of the things that are really problematic for the society that was around them or around us, and create a much better world. The term utopian comes from Thomas More, a theologian from several centuries earlier, and a book that he wrote, which he called Utopia, in which he laid out a vision, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely, of an almost perfect society. In the workings, the thinking of the utopian socialists, what they were trying to do was create a society in which people would get along without strife, in a system of mutual support, where they would rely on one another's goodwill. In practice, these 3 theorists also were activists. They established communities that were sort of experimental in what came to be called utopian socialism. People worked together, and They did share many of the pieces of property. They shared much of the labor that went into production. They shared in child rearing, and they were really very much a communal sort of enterprise. All three of them saw the exploitation, the antagonism, the strife that was produced by capitalism, and they were looking for some kind of alternative. They hypothesized about how to engineer an ideal society, and they set up experimental communities. Probably for Americans, the best known of those would be New Harmony in Indiana, which was established, well, the commune of New Harmony was already in existence before Robert Owen, but Owen established what he then termed New Harmony. That was a name that he gave to the place. And for a couple of years, he was able to operate it as a cooperative, communal sort of social experiment. In all, the utopian socialist experiments had mixed results. In many cases, they did establish good, pleasant systems of sharing and interaction, but as a way of transforming society at large, it really was not very successful, and most of the utopian communities really fell apart after a few years. That was true of New Harmony. It still exists as a city in Indiana, but as a socialist commune, it fell apart fairly quickly. It's probably also worth pointing out that the idea of utopian socialism in some ways is still very much with us. We can see examples of similar experimental communities in Occupy Wall Street from a few years ago, CHOP in Seattle, which was created in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing, or the experiment of People's Park in Berkeley, California, in 1969, which I experienced when I was a student at UC Berkeley during the 1960s. And I published an essay about that in the DSA magazine about a year ago. What really struck me was that Engels was not simply dismissing these theorists. He appreciated them as theorists and activists, but at the same time, he did identify some shortcomings. In particular, he notes that they didn't really understand the history of socioeconomic relations. They didn't have a good scientific understanding of what led to capitalism or what it would take to escape from the capitalist system. They lacked the kind of scientific understanding, as Engels put it, that would be provided by a dialectical materialist perspective, and then the rest of the essay is an exposition of dialectical materialism. Part 2 explains the notion of the dialectic. This was something that Marx and Engels had primarily borrowed from the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, or G.W.F. Hegel, who was one of the most prominent German philosophers of the early 19th century. Hegel definitely influenced the thinking of both Marx and Engels. And in part 2 of the essay, Engels lays out some of the basic points that Hegel was trying to make. Most fundamentally, everything is changing. Everything is constantly changing. In fact, the only constant in the universe is change. Change doesn't just come about by accident, but it's created, it's produced by internal contradictions. The focus, because things are constantly changing, should not be on how things are, but on the process of becoming. And Engels has a passage that he quotes from Heraclitus, the Greek philosopher, who he also identifies as an early proponent of the dialectical perspective. He quotes Heraclitus as saying, "Everything is and is not, for everything is fluid, is constantly changing, is constantly coming into being and passing away." This he contrasts with the more common approach that was out and about when Engels was writing, and he calls that more common approach metaphysics. He says, to the metaphysician, in contrast with the dialectician, to the metaphysician, things and their mental reflexes, ideas, are isolated, are to be considered one after the other and apart from each other, are objects of investigation, fixed, rigid, given once and for all. He thinks in absolutely irreconcilable antitheses. For him, that is for the metaphysician, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative absolutely exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in rigid antithesis to one another. Now, my first thought when I read that, and I'll throw the question out to all of you. So what's wrong with that? It seems very reasonable. Something can't be both itself and something else. Cause and effect are very different from one another. Positive and negative are not the same thing. How can something be both positive and negative? It seems almost common sense. So what's the objection? I don't know if you want to take a few moments to talk about that now, or go into it at the end.
Yeah, we can definitely open up Stack if there's anyone that wants to expand on this a little bit. So if you, just want to type in Stack in the chat, and then we'll call on you. So Mike C.
Yeah. I'm sorry, what was the problem with metaphysics, was your question, or what he calls metaphysics?
With the description that he gives, a thing either exists or does not exist. A thing cannot at the same time be itself and something else. Positive and negative exclude one another. Cause and effect stand in antithesis to one another.
Right.
Isn't that reasonable?
When considering that could be reasonable, or at least applicable, when considering the interrelationship between two things considered in isolation, but nothing exists in isolation, disconnected from the context in which it actually exists in the real world. So like, I don't know, I always thought of that metaphysical reasoning, what he calls metaphysics, which can be confusing if you have a background in like analytic philosophy or like a standard like Anglo education of philosophy, because we think metaphysics meaning like the way Aristotle used it, right? But like this, what he terms that, and some later Marxists also term that metaphysical reasoning. It always struck me as like essentially like idealist, like these were materialist philosophers, but they didn't go I guess, far enough in that they abstracted from the world just what they were trying to study, but only then analyzed it, conceived of it, what have you, in abstraction out of its context, right? But everything can only be understood within its context, not only the context, the process of change, but in its interrelationship with other things. I hope that made sense.
Okay. Thank you.
We've got Kevin on stack.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit easier to understand if we remember how influenced Marx and Engels were by Darwin's work and the theory of evolution. And I think that's a good way to look at it is, you know, we try in evolutionary biology to create these sharp divides that there is, you know, between different species, but and in most cases there are, but there was also this period where the humans were human and we weren't quite humans. But we also see it in all kinds of other natural phenomena. And the question of, I was just encountered this in some medieval philosophy, right? Because these questions have been going on, is they were debating the same question that gets argued about around abortion rights, which is when is a fetus alive and when is it not? And I mean, what you find out, right, whether you're a religious scholar in the Middle Ages or a scientist now, there's really no way to answer that question. There's not really like one point at which something is alive and then is not, or when it's not alive and it is. And an example that I often talk about, I sometimes teach philosophy to 4th and 5th graders, which is super fun. And one of the things we talk about is how all of the molecules in our body are constantly being replaced by new molecules. And by the time you're, 43 years old, like me, I don't have any of the original molecules left in my body. I am an entirely different, like none of them are there. I might have some of them back again, that's possible. But, so yeah, I am the same person that I've always been, but in other ways, I am not that person at all.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think that really gets at the heart of what Engels was saying there, that things are complicated, things are contradictory, things are ambiguous. And I was struck by his passage about the difference between life and death, which seems to be a pretty straightforward, obvious distinction. You can say pretty definitively in most cases that this person is no longer alive or this person is still alive. But when we start talking about a fetus in the womb, at what point is this a living human being? And that is obviously very much connected to a major political debate, which we're having right now in the United States, and in fact, in many other places. So if maybe I should go on a little bit here. Engels quotes Hegel as commenting another aspect of the dialectic. All things are in their essence relative. All things are interrelated and interact in such a way as to create an ongoing positive feedback process. The way Engels himself puts it, the whole world, natural, historical, intellectual, is represented as a process that is as in constant motion, change, transformation, development, and the attempt is made to trace out the internal connection that makes a continuous whole of this movement and development. That is a notion that, as an anthropologist, we refer to it as holism. and it's relevant to what we do in my discipline. When we're trying to understand a culture, we can't take one part of that culture or that social system and understand it in isolation. It only makes sense in relation to all of the other parts and how they fit together. Another aspect of the dialectic is the difference between quantitative and qualitative change. This is something that Engels goes into more in other works, like the Dialectics of Nature. But in general, he makes the point that small quantitative changes occur on an ongoing basis, and that these changes are cumulative. You have a little bit of change, a little bit more change, a little bit more change, and then you get to a certain point, and the old underlying structure can no longer handle all of the changes that have taken place, so that there's a fundamental restructuring, or what might be called a qualitative change. This is relevant in social relations, in the distinction between evolution and revolution, or evolutionary and revolutionary change. I remember when I was in middle school, teachers trying to explain the difference between what they called socialism and communism. And they said that socialists believe in evolutionary change, small changes that eventually will lead to a different kind of economic system, whereas communists believe in revolutionary change, which is sudden and which is dangerous, but it has to be one or the other. What Engels was saying is that changes are not one or the other, that both quantitative and qualitative change are part and parcel of the same process. In the Dialectics of Nature, he uses what I think is a pretty good illustration. Imagine a pot of water on the stove, and you begin to heat it. And as you heat the water, the molecules start moving faster and faster as the temperature goes from, let's say, 150 to 155 to 160, 165. But then you get to a certain point. At sea level, it would be 212 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, it's not just a matter of the molecules moving a little bit faster, but you start forming bubbles of gas in the water. And those bubbles escape as steam or as water vapor, so that you have a qualitative change of liquid water into a gas. The same general point could be made in terms of social change. You have a social system that is constantly changing. Most of the changes are small, but at a certain point, the changes add up, and the old structure can no longer sustain the new system with all of the changes. And so you have a fundamental restructuring or a revolution. Hegel, according to Engels, conveyed an understanding and appreciation of the dialectic, but was off base because his dialectic was an idealist dialectic. According to Hegel, the moving force in history was found in the mind, and particularly in what he referred to as the world spirit. Marx and Engels, by contrast, proposed what they called a materialist dialectic. So what then is the difference between idealism and materialism? I don't know if this is news to anybody on this this Zoom call, but for a lot of people, the words in English idealism and materialism have a very different connotation. Somebody who is materialist, who's described as being materialist, is thought to be someone who is maybe self-centered, money grubbing, who is worried about having the most comfortable possible, most luxurious physical surroundings. By contrast, an idealist is somebody with high ideals, somebody who really is willing to sacrifice his own or her own well-being for the benefit of other people in the community at large. That's not what Marx and Engels meant when they referred to idealism and materialism. Idealism is the idea that that social change comes about primarily as a result of people's ideas, their thoughts, their values, whereas materialism suggests that people's thoughts, people's values, people's ideas are generated primarily from their material surroundings. The basic principle of materialism is summed up in part 3 in the very first paragraph, where Engels says, the materialist conception of history, and that's another expression that Marx and Engels use, historical materialism or the materialist conception of history. The materialist conception of history starts from the proposition that the production of the means to support human life, and next to production, the exchange of things produced, is the basis of all social structure, that in every society that has appeared in history, the manner in which wealth is distributed and society divided into classes or orders is dependent upon what is produced, how it's produced, and how the products are exchanged. From this point of view, the final causes of all social changes and political revolutions are to be sought not in men's brains, not in men's better insights into eternal truth and justice, but in changes in the modes of production and exchange. They are to be sought not in the philosophy, but in the economics of a particular epoch. That's a point that Marx and Engels made in a number of contexts. Considerably earlier, in the early part of their book, The German Ideology, they make a very similar statement. They say, we must begin by stating the first premise of all human existence, that men must be in a position to live in order to be able to make history. But life involves, before everything else, eating and drinking, a habitation, clothing, and many other things. The first historical act is thus the production of the means to satisfy those ends, the production of material life itself. The second fundamental point is that as soon as a need is satisfied, which implies the action of satisfying and the acquisition of an instrument, new needs are made, and this production of new needs is the first historical act. Now that is their representation of historical materialism. There are various ideas, various forms of materialism, and there is one version that is much more extreme than the dialectical materialism of Marx and Engels. It's been called by a number of terms: mechanistic materialism, mechanical materialism. Marx and Engels sometimes called it crude materialism or vulgar materialism. basically, that is an approach that starts from the premise that everything in the universe consists of matter and energy, that matter and energy interact according to definite laws, and therefore, hypothetically, this is not something that happens in real life, but hypothetically, if you knew the location, the quantity, the movement, the direction, and the laws of interaction of every bit of matter and energy in the universe, you should be able to predict everything that will ever happen from that point on to infinity. Now, obviously, we're not at that stage. We probably never will be anywhere near that stage. But in principle, that's what mechanistic or vulgar materialism says. Marx and Engels are proposing dialectical materialism, which recognizes that there is an important role for ideas, for ideology, for philosophy. They're just not the fundamental starting point. Another way to put this would be to say that Marx and Engels are not economic determinists. They think economics is really important, but it doesn't determine everything in a one-to-one sort of way. This point is made most dramatically, I think, in a letter that Engels sent to a collaborator named Joseph Bloch in 1890. And it's one of my favorite passages from all of Marxist literature. Engels says, according to the materialist conception of history, the ultimately, and he emphasized ultimately, determining element in history is the production and reproduction of real life. More than this, neither Marx nor I has ever asserted. Hence, if somebody twists this into saying that the economic element is the only determining one, he transforms that proposition into a meaningless, abstract, senseless phrase. At the end of the letter, Engels concedes, Marx and I are ourselves partly to blame for the fact that younger people sometimes lay more stress on the economic side than is due to it. We had to emphasize the main principle vis-a-vis our adversaries who denied it. And we had not always the time, the place, or the opportunity to give their due to the other elements of the interaction. But when it came to presenting a section of history, that is, making a practical application, it was a different matter, and there no error was permissible. Unfortunately, however, it happens only too often that people think they have fully understood a new theory and can apply it without more ado from the moment they have assimilated its main principles, and even those not always correctly. I cannot exempt many of the more recent so-called Marxists from this reproach, for the most amazing rubbish has been produced in this quarter too. It's, I think, quite refreshing to see that Engels was willing to criticize people who held him and Marx up as sort of the paragons of intellectual and political leadership. Fundamentally, when Marx and Engels look at a kind of society, they look at several elements, what they called the forces of production, relations of production, and ideology. And they suggest that the forces of production are responsible for the class structure, and the class structure of a particular society is what determines the mode of production. Productive forces change, that's inevitable. And as they change, the old ruling class doesn't want to give up power, so it tries to hang on. But the new society is no longer conducive to the rule of the old leadership. And if the old leadership, the old ruling class tries too long to hang on, it becomes necessary to have a revolutionary upheaval to change the system. The rest of that part 3 consists of presenting details about the material conditions and the contradictions that exist or existed in feudalism, how that gave rise to capitalism, the contradictions within capitalism, and how those contradictions could eventually be resolved by a socialist revolution. In a feudal system, peasants produce primarily for themselves and their families. In some cases, they do sell a little bit to others. A portion of what they produce may be handed over to feudal lords, but for the most part, they are producing things that they expect to use themselves. During the period of early capitalism, you have artisans, particularly moving to the cities, again, producing largely for themselves, forming guilds, and then starting to sell some of the things that they have produced to others. But even within the context of the guild, the apprentice may pay for the education he or she receives, and the payment, the exchange of money or other material resources is compensation that is required for the education necessary to become experts themselves. Industrial capitalism, on the other hand, is quite different. And Engels points to a number of contradictions. The most pervasive one is probably the contradiction between socialized production, which we find in factories, where you have a lot of people working together on a production line. No one person is able to control the productive process by him or herself, but rather a lot of people have to work together to put out the end profit. So on the one hand, you have socialized production, but on the other hand, you have individual ownership and production for profit. So you have the capitalist, the owner of the factory or of the business, who purchases the labor power of the workers. And you have yet another contradiction beginning to arise, the contradiction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers. In a capitalist system, it's in the interest of the owners, the capitalists, the people who purchase the labor power of others to maximize their profits. That's what the system is all about. So it's in their interest to get the most work they possibly can from their workers while maximizing their profits by spending as little as possible on wages and working conditions. By contrast, it's in the interest of the proletarians to get the highest wages they can and to have the most humane conditions for working. So inevitably, workers and bosses, workers and capitalists find themselves at odds with one another. You also have the anarchy of production in capitalism. It's a competitive system where each business, each factory, each corporation is competing against others, those that are able to operate most efficiently. Again, efficiency in the capitalist sense of maximizing profits. Those that are able to compete most efficiently win the competition and put the others out of business. There are some winners, some losers. The capitalists who end up losing then become proletarians themselves. They have to sell their own labor power in order to make a living. So over time, the proletariat gets larger and poorer. The bourgeoisie becomes smaller and wealth becomes more concentrated. The bourgeoisie also controls an apparatus known as the state, which enforces its continued rule. And then we have the notion of surplus value. Essentially, what this gets at is that the capitalists make a profit by having workers produce greater value than what they pay to the workers. The capitalist pays the worker in order to produce something, and then the capitalist has to be able to sell that product for more than what was paid to the worker. So that difference is surplus value. But there's a problem with surplus value, and that is that if you are paying the workers less than what you want to sell the products for, who's going to buy those products? The workers don't have the money to buy them. And so we have a couple of things going on. One is imperialism, where the capitalists look for new places, new markets to sell the things that they can't sell at home. The other is the business cycle, where at times the capitalists pay the workers relatively well. The workers have relatively large amounts of cash that they're able to use to purchase the products. And things seem to be going reasonably well, but then you hit a recession or a depression, and you have workers out of work. They have even less money to spend on whatever is produced. The capitalists respond by cutting back on production, so even more workers are out of work, and that creates a strain on the entire system, which Engels and Marx predicted would eventually lead to socialist revolution. With socialist revolution, the contradictions, not necessarily all contradictions, but the specific contradictions that are inherent in capitalism are resolved. The contradiction between proletarians and capitalists or bourgeoisie is resolved because after the socialist revolution, there is no longer a bourgeoisie. And in fact, if there is only one class, a one-class society is by definition a no-class society. So without social classes, without oppression, without people trying to make profits off one another, the state is no longer necessary. And in one very memorable phrase, Marx and Engels predict that the rule over people will be replaced by the administration of things. And I think that I've probably taken plenty of time, but that I think covers most of the major points that Engels is trying to lay out. And let's throw the floor open to questions, comments, general discussion.
Thank you so much, Rick. Yeah, and if everyone, if there's any questions or discussions you'd like to start, again, feel free to type in stack in the chat, and we'll be sure to call on you.
Was there anything critical that I left out? Do you find
Yeah.
it convincing?
It looks like we've got Dominic on stack.
Hey, yeah, it's a question, because I still need to read through parts 2 and 3. For understanding parts 2 and 3, is it important to do additional reading and develop more nuanced understanding of the 3 utopian socialists that are kind of primed in part 1?
I'm sorry, are you saying that to understand, well, it's really part 1 where he deals with the utopian socialists, and it's probably the case with the entire essay that the more you know about other writers or other things that Marx and Engels have written, the more you'll get out of this essay. I do agree that at least to me, the section on the utopian socialists is really kind of a prologue. It doesn't present an awful lot of critical substance. And to evaluate what Engels has to say about the utopian socialists, it would be useful to know more about the utopian socialists themselves. What he's trying to do, I think, is to create a background, a context within which to present what are really the fundamental points that he's trying to get across in parts 2 and 3.
Awesome. And Mike, I know you were on stack a little earlier. Are you good now, or did you want to talk?
Sure. I was just going to comment on how the work really is. I really like this work a lot. It's very like dense with important points that I think a lot of people nowadays don't know about or miss. And what stood out to me as worth highlighting from what you talked about was just the socialized nature of production. So like in socialized, that means the production, we're not actually socializing production itself. That would be, we're just socializing appropriation. In capitalism, production is already socialized. All, you know, economic value and wealth is a social product. And I just think that's really important to understand. I think I could ramble about that, but I talk enough, so.
Okay. Yeah, I think that that is the case, that if Engels is correct, then production at this point is pretty thoroughly socialized. There are very few people who actually make all of the things that they use. What remains to be socialized is how the things that get produced are distributed, or as Mike put it, appropriation. I think that in a capitalist system where somebody is taking what people have produced and taking it away and using it for his or her own personal benefit, appropriation is probably an appropriate description. If what we have is a society where people are working together to produce the things that everybody needs and then share those things among themselves, I would use the word distribution rather than appropriation. I guess one point that Engels makes that I didn't mention and probably deserves to be noted is that with capitalism, you have, well, I did mention the anarchy of production, but one of the changes that he imagines occurring in a socialist society is that there would be general centralized planning so that factories are actually producing what people need and not making decisions on a one-by-one basis, so that you don't have a situation where one company is producing a whole bunch of stuff that nobody really wants or needs because there's another factory that's producing the same thing and they're not coordinating. He doesn't really get into the converse of that, which is just as much of a problem, maybe even more of a problem, where separate corporations actually do collaborate among themselves. And that gets into monopoly capitalism. And that's something that really developed much more fully after Marx and Engels' death, but they saw the beginnings of it. Other thoughts?
Yeah, Kevin on Stack.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to highlight from section 3, well, actually two things from section 3 that I wanted to highlight. And one, I would argue this is one of the better and more concise descriptions of how capitalist crises happen. And what I really appreciate about it is that Engels is really clear is that for the first time in history, people are in need and want of basic things, not because there is a shortage, but because there is too much. Right? We have people starving because there's too much food. And if you would have, I mean, I just imagine what thinkers in previous eras would have thought of that. They and how absurd this seems, but we see it all the time, where it's actually overproduction and like excess productive capacity that leads to people out of work and losing their homes and hungry. And but Engels, there's also the other thing I wanted to highlight is a point that Engels makes about the central, maybe he says that the central contradiction of capitalism is the contradiction between social production and private ownership.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's interesting, especially that he states that so explicitly, because there's a common idea among a lot of people who would call themselves Marxists, who say that the tendency of the rate of profit to decline is the central contradiction of capitalism. And Engels quite explicitly says something very different here. So I think it's, I just think that's an interesting point as well, that debate wasn't necessarily going on that much, I don't think, at least when he wrote this. But it's a debate that's sort of become a major debate within, at least within certain Marxist circles.
Yes, and definitely definitely Marx and Engels wrote a lot of things that they didn't fully develop, in part because they just didn't have an opportunity to see how things would develop. But later Marxists have discussed and developed these ideas much more fully. And I know that, for example, a lot of people who think of themselves as socialists have different opinions about Lenin, let's say, and whether Lenin was a Marxist or a traitor to the cause of Marxism. But one of the things that Lenin did that I think is worthwhile is to take certain Marxist ideas and project them into the 20th century. He wrote a book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. And I think that by looking at Marx's understanding of capitalist economics, he was basically right in projecting that capitalism, that imperialism would be a fundamental outcome. Any other thoughts or questions?
Yeah, Dominic on Stack.
Yeah, I had another question about, so in part one, there's a paragraph. I'll just copy and paste it into the chat. When I was reading this last night, one of the questions that came to mind is it like, I guess, is it proper understanding of this particular paragraph? It's like Engels saying that they didn't really have a conceptualization of class in the same manner that Engels did, like these three utopian socialists, or did they have like different definitions, or were they starting to like define what the proletariat was? And is that term proletariat, is that like new? Is that like unique to Engels and Marx? Like, did they introduce that as a term?
Yeah, I can't really answer that. Maybe somebody else can. My understanding is that the word proletariat was around for a good bit of time. I'm not sure what language it originally comes from, but they certainly popularized the expression in certain circles.
I can answer the question about proletariat. It actually is a term that existed in ancient Rome that referred to landless laborers, landless free laborers who lived in the cities, and that was there that they were labeled proletarians. So Marx and Engels, like they do with a lot of stuff, they actually borrowed pretty heavily from the language of ancient Rome.
So proletariat, in your understanding, is from Latin? Thank you, that's helpful. And it's certainly the case that Marx and Engels spent a good deal of time studying the classics and drawing from the classics.
Yeah, we've got Sid on Stack.
I was just wondering if you have suggestions about how to avoid being a crude materialist. How culture or other oppressions, the myriad of different oppressions, how that affects. Anyway, I guess just how we could be more subtle or sophisticated about our thinking without throwing out the crux of what Engels is talking about.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that we continue to struggle with. Just speaking from my perspective as an anthropologist, it's something that we are continuing to debate in my discipline. We have a number of rather prominent anthropological theorists who have given materialist interpretations of interesting cultural phenomena, and they have been pretty doctrinaire to the point where they've been criticized as crude materialists or mechanistic materialists. Marvin Harris, who, if you've studied anthropology, is a name you might recognize, is one of the primary figures in that school of thought. He, in fact, refers to his approach as cultural materialism. Then you have others who have been influenced by Marx, who are very much concerned with ideology. Probably the most influential anthropologist when I was in graduate school was the French anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who was who identified himself as a Marxist, but he borrowed the dialectic with not very much attention to material conditions. And he wrote about things like what he called the savage mind, the structure of pre-capitalist thought. Basically, I think my answer is that what you really have to do is take this on a case-by-case basis, look at the evidence, and make a determination based on your understanding of the evidence, to what extent the conditions that you're looking at are being brought about by material forces, to what extent is ideology a factor, and how do ideology and material conditions interplay?
Awesome. We've got Mike on stack as well.
Yeah, I was just going to mention as far as if you wanted more information about the differences between Marx's dialectic materialism, although it wasn't called that during their lifetime, and mechanistic materialism. I mentioned this in the chat earlier when it came up in conversation because I think it's really approachable and helpful. His thesis on Feuerbach is really helpful and good to read. It's very, very short. It was actually, I think, an outline he wrote for the German ideology. It's just 11 statements. And you can find like a few, I don't know, blog posts that break them down and explain further if you want, or I also know of a PowerPoint presentation I can send you about it if you want. So if you're curious about that, I'd recommend the theses on Feuerbach, or I don't know, if you want to, as I'm speaking, I just remember there's also Maurice Cornforth, was a Marxist philosopher who's just exceptionally easy to read, who wrote a lot about materialism, and his Materialism, the Dialectical Method, is online for free. And it's just really, really,
Who did you say?
I'll put in the chat here, Maurice Cornforth.
Oh,
Just occurred to me as like a really easy to read person. And where is it? Oh, yeah, I have his book right here. He contrasts mechanistic materialism in chapter 23 or chapter 3. So just, oh, while I'm stuck, I just remembered or just thought of, I would love your thoughts, Rick, about you're talking about the relationship between like ideology and the influence on that. You know, I really need to dig into later Marxist philosophers after him, like in the 20th century. I've focused a lot on understanding the classics first. Could you comment on, just out of curiosity, like Gramsci or somebody like that, as far as like what their or later philosophers contributed to that? I have a book from him, but I've yet to dig into it.
mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm actually wondering if maybe someone else would like to weigh in on Gramsci. I have, again, looked at some of what he wrote, but a long time ago. My recollection, and this is at this point kind of vague, is that he developed the idea of hegemony, which fundamentally involves the ruling class convincing the members of the oppressed classes of an ideology that is in the interest not of the oppressed, but of the oppressors. He developed this in his prison notebooks while he was in prison in Italy under Mussolini, as I recall. And the idea of hegemony, I think, resonates with the fact that there are an awful lot of people who are members of the working class who are not particularly well off financially, who are gung-ho supporters of Trump and the Stop the Steal movement and so on and so forth. Why? It's, from our point of view, not in their interest to accept that ideology, but they have somehow become convinced that that is the truth of the matter, that they are better off if they endorse authoritarian capitalism, if they refuse to get vaccinated for COVID, and all of the other things that we're seeing among the diehard Trump supporters these days. But maybe somebody else has something to offer on Gramsci.
Yeah, Ben, go ahead.
Hey everybody, sorry I'm eating, so I have my camera off for the most part. I just wanted to maybe get people's thoughts on like what was if there was one thing that jumped out at you about this whole thing. So I just read this today. I was listening to the audiobook and then I was kind of following along in the text as I was listening. And the part that I think jumped out at me the most, and I feel like Engels kind of jumps over it, mentions it and then very quickly moves on to something else, is talking about the shortening of labor time by the improvement of machinery and the technology used to produce things and how it's going to create this industrial reserve army. And this is the kind of Keynesian argument that we've heard for a long time, that eventually machines will get so good that people don't have to work but more than a few hours a week, and then we eventually like create this by accident, if you will, just because technology gets so much better. But that hasn't happened. And David Graeber, among other people, has this notion of bullshit jobs, right? Things that people are employed to do and paid to do simply because we need to pay people to do things. Otherwise, we might have this industrial reserve army on our hands. And this is something I'm interested in professionally. I think I'm interested in the task of automation. It's something I enjoy doing. And usually I'm doing it as a hobby project for myself to automate something that I don't want to do by hand. But at an industrial scale, this is we don't need people doing a lot of the work they need to do. And I just think it's just an interesting idea. I don't have a lot of extra thoughts, but it's just something that gets me thinking, this notion that like people don't have to work. And if they don't, then they can start to organize their lives differently than if they're working 40 hours a week. This is also something that's been pertinent to me because I quit my job in July and have been out of a job since. So I've had a lot of extra time, and I, cut a deal with my partner beforehand that I would do all of the social reproductive labor in the house and all the grocery shopping and the dishes and all these things. And it's been going great. And I'm really hesitant to get back into the workplace, but I have to because, the money's run dry, and I have to be a good wage worker again. So anyway, that's a bit of a ramble, but I just wanted to hear kind of what like, if there was one thing you highlighted in the book, what was it? And kind of what did it make you think of? Check.
Well, I think I would respond maybe not by highlighting one thing in the book, but your comment on machines and increasing productivity and efficiency. And of course, this is a topic that has concerned working people for a good long time. I'll call your attention to the Luddite movement. And we still see a lot of workers, and it seems very strange that workers are, on the one hand, threatened by the productive machinery, by robots and other machinery that makes it easier for human beings to accomplish less, or to accomplish more with less effort and in less time. And you would think that that would mean that there's more to go around and that people have more food and more of all of the things that they enjoy in life with less effort, with less time, with less wear and tear on their minds and bodies. And it seems that it's actually the opposite that's happening, that the more we have jobs that people used to do being taken over by computers and robots, the more people are out of work, the more people are threatened. And so we find ourselves as working people just really resisting the idea that human beings can be replaced by machines. And of course, that doesn't mean that machines are not continually being invented and improved. It seems to be one of those things that has been happening for a long time and will probably continue to happen for a long time. But the results just seem to be irrational.
I know we're coming up on about 5 minutes left for our scheduled time here. So is there anyone else that would like to jump on Stack or bring up any issue for discussion? If not, I think we can probably wrap it up here. Awesome.
Well, thanks to all of you for tuning in. I hope that it was a worthwhile hour and a half that we've spent together.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining, being part of this, taking time out of your busy schedule. If you would, if you're interested in helping us put these kinds of events on, we do have our next political education committee meeting happening on the 19th